Welcome back to Boring Dad Sleep Stories. I'm the Boring Dad, and you're listening to a section-by-section reading of Jim Munroe's novel, Everyone in Silico, published in 2004. And here's a quick but important note. This reading is done with the direct permission of Jim Munroe himself, the dead-set legend who emailed me back within 24 hours saying that I could do this. Thanks, Jim. This novel is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike license. This means you can share it freely, but not for commercial purposes, and you must attribute the work to the author. This project is a love letter to the book itself, which I accidentally stumbled upon, and so glad that I did, and in general is a way to support open culture and to push out the work onto the world of amazing authors who have really tried hard to make it so that we can access work without having to go through big publishers if we don't want to. So, thanks, Jim. And as always, I dedicate this entire channel to my two sons. And boys, you're 6 and 3 years old at the moment, but you will enjoy this book as much as I do when it's the right time. Your mother and I love you so much. Avanti. Section 1. When Paul sat down on the bench, the young man moved over a bit without looking at him. His gaze was fixed on something in the sky. Paul crossed his arms and looked down the tracks. The young man made a quiet noise. Paul looked at him and then followed the young man's eyes up. All Paul saw were the gleaming buildings of Frisco's business district, several stretching higher than the eye could register. "Yeah, they've built them big here," Paul said. "They're not just scraping the sky, they go up forever." The young man looked at him for the first time. Paul's face was an indistinct blur of features, his suit fashionably cut. "Oh," the young man said, looking up again. "No, I was watching the ad." He pointed at the empty sky. Paul turned the dial on his watch, and the blue sky turned into a giant man running through a forest with a six-pack of Pepsi strapped to his head. The buildings obscured some of the ad. The man stopped, pulled off a can, and opened it. "Ah, yes," Paul said. He noticed movement to his left. A giant panda with a fedora was parachuting to the ground. Paul recognized the panda as the mascot for an insurance company. He turned the knob on his watch, and both waving panda and Pepsi ad disappeared. The young man was looking at him. "So you guys still wear the scramble faces, even here," the young man said. Paul shrugged. "You get used to it. Same as the ties." The young man looked at his own tie. "Yeah, I never thought I'd get used to it," he said, twisting it around like a noose. "But you do." Paul laughed, looked down the tracks. Far off in the distance, there was a trolley car almost too tiny to see. If you don't mind me asking," the young man said. Paul looked back, his face a flurry of faces, a cipher. It's none of my business," said the young man. "But," he pointed to Paul's watch, "if you're platinum, why are you taking the trolley car?" "Oh," Paul laughed. "I just enjoy it. Clears my head. Gives me time to think." "I see," the young man said, the blank look on his face clearly communicating that he didn't. Paul started to look back at the approaching trolley car. "I'm actually silver," blurted the young man. Paul looked back at the young man who was smoothing his hair back. "A lot of people assume I'm bronze because I take the trolley car, but it's just that I can't port. There's a technical glitch." "Really?" Paul said. "That's too bad." He got up. The young man jumped up too. "Yeah, and check this out. I'm going to try to port home," the young man said. "Watch." The young man turned into a black silhouette of himself. Around the edges of the silhouette, light and image bent inwards. "Wow," said Paul, stepping away. "That, looks bad," the young man returned, his face agitated. "I know. It only happens when I try to port, though. Otherwise I'm fine. They say it should clear up soon." Paul nodded. The trolley car stopped, and the doors opened. It was never good to work on an empty stomach, but Nikki had procrastinated to the point where there was no other choice. At least I'm just hungry, not hungry and wet, Nikki thought as she wandered down Commercial Drive, welcoming the sun on her face like a long-lost friend. The rainy season was over. Vancouver had finally shucked off winter's grey cloak, and the strip of stores and restaurants seemed cleaner, newer, reflecting Nikki's small smile back at her. "Nicholas," said someone coming out of the Safeway. "Hey, JK," Nikki said, turning. "Little shopping?" JK lifted his bulging bags as he backed away. "Lot of shopping. Gotta go. Like the new cut. Looks like an octopus is sitting on your head." Nikki smiled and shook her thin ponytails. "Why, thanks, Joseph Kindertoy." She tried not to stare at his bags as she waved goodbye. In the first Starbucks she saw, she noticed some kids she knew, so she waved and kept on going. The Starbucks a block down looked clear, however, so she held her watch on the rusty plate until the door buzz-clicked. Breathing a silent, relieved breath, she hadn't been positive she had enough for a coffee. She threw her stuff at a table near the window and went up to the counter. As the machine filled her cup, she watched the people bustling by. Spring was all over their faces, as obvious and gleeful as strawberry jam. Nikki put sugar and 2 milk buds into her coffee and watched the door. Mostly tourists, since the kids from the drive favored the outlet she'd passed by. The steam from her cup curled around and coalesced briefly into the Starbucks logo, then dissipated. An older, masked couple came in and tentatively looked around the cafe. Nikki rifled through her watch for something to read. She found an article on using Easy Cut for amphibious splicing and got her watch to project it on the table instead of her retina. After a minute, she checked the couple out over the rim of her coffee cup. They were at the counter, waiting for a couple of boys to finish filling their soup tureen mugs. They were as noisy as their clothes. The boys finally touched their watches to the pay plate, bouncing them off it in a perfunctory way. "Next time, ask him where his body's at," the kid said on his way out the door, and his red-capped friend exploded in a honk laugh that made the masked man step back briefly, place a hand to secure his mask, then square his shoulders and pretend he was rubbing his face. Nikki strained to hear what the man was saying to the woman in his quiet voice, noticed that he touched his bare fingers to the pay plate. Nikki smiled inside. Loaded. Only the utterly destitute and the fabulously wealthy did without watches. After casually pressing a black pellet onto the surface of the table next to her, Nikki leaned away from it and absorbed herself in her article. The woman stood for a second with the classic lattes, holding them well away from her white smock, and surveyed the room before nodding the man towards the table next to Nikki. Good, Nikki thought, tapping a protein DNA graphic in her article and pretending to watch it unravel. There was a movement from her backpack, and Nikki's heart rate suddenly spiked. Moving her legs slowly, she placed one of her feet on the opening of the bag, then the other one. She could feel pushing against the side of her shoe. "Settle down, you little shit," Nikki thought. "You're not the only one who's hungry." She nervously glanced at the couple as they draped their coats over their chairs, but they seemed comfortable. The man even took off his mask, despite the woman's disapproving clucking. He had a square jaw and full lips, which he pressed against her ivory fingers. She had had her nails coated in mirror, and he pretended to stare at himself in them. She hit him and giggled. Nikki, not looking up, lifted her foot. For a second, nothing. And then, just as she was considering kicking the bag, a brown blur. It had crawled up the man's leg and launched itself onto their table before the couple registered what was happening. Luckily, the woman's mask muffled her scream because even then it bored into Nikki's ears. Nikki snatched the brown animal to her chest and surreptitiously slipped a black pellet into its mouth. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't know how it got out. My bag was closed." The man's mask was back on his face, and a halo was starting to generate around the two of them. Nicky stroked the head of the tiny pug-faced little bulldog with a single finger and murmured reassurances to it. The animal, however, was fully pacified by the pellet and stared at the couple with honey-liquid eyes. "Oh, what a beautiful little, creature," the woman said, holding out her hand. "Turn off that silly thing, Alex," she said. The halo disappeared. "Sorry," Alex said to both Nicky and the woman. "It's just—" Nicky looked down, kept patting the bulldog. "It's just nothing. He's paranoid," the woman said, reluctantly taking her eyes off the bulldog to look at Nicky. "He's been watching the news too much. I apologize for his rudeness." She looked back at the bulldog. "Can I—" Nicky glanced at her. "Go on. Beg." "May I, hold him?" she said. "Her," Nicky stated, firmly, as if she cared. The woman leaned back, a little beaten. Nicky noticed the lines around her eyes and worried she'd pushed too hard. "May I hold her?" she said, finally. Nicky paused for effect, looked down at the little critter, and then slowly extended her hands. Oh, she's a frisky. Oh, the woman said, her exclamations echoing in her mask. The little bulldog was trying to climb out of her hand and up her smock, its little paws gripping the Red Cross design printed there. Careful, Simone," said Alex, his eyes watching Simone's rapturous face as much as the little dog. Nicky noted the emotions washing over his face and thought, not for the first time, that some couples might as well have childless stamped on their foreheads. The dog was gnawing on her finger, and Simone was delighted by this. "Oh, Alex, look at... Oh, it thinks my finger is a bone." Alex responded, looking at Nicky with an assessing eye. At this, Nicky held out her hand for the dog, and Simone reluctantly returned it. "So warm." Where'd you get it?" Alex said, trying to sound conversational, taking a sip of his coffee. "I made her," Nicky said. "With what?" Alex said, dubiously. "You know, those do-it-yourself kits," Nicky said. Simone nodded. "I had one of those when I was a kid. Mine didn't work." "They never did," Alex said. "They always turned out wrong messes." "Yeah," Nicky agreed. "She was my fourth try. I bonsai'd her. It took the better part of a year. Even then it was kind of a fluke. That's her name, actually. Fluky." "Fluky? Oh, that's cute," Simone murmured. She looked at Alex. Nicky let the dog chew on her finger, trying not to lose her nerve. She thought about JK's bulging grocery bags and forced herself to smile. "Yeah, I've seen a bonsai tiger go for $10,000, and it wasn't nearly as unique. It just looked like a cat." $10,000, huh?" Alex said, almost to himself. He glanced at Simone. "I couldn't see paying more than $5. Nicky frowned outwardly, while a joyous melody of cash registers cha-chinged in her head. By the time she got back to her place, the sun was dropping behind the mountains. In the dim light, she could still make out that her front door had been flashed. "Can you afford not to upgrade? Go for yourself." But Nicky ignored the giant block letters and let herself in. She had to swipe her watch twice before it snicked open. Cheap piece of shit. She went into the kitchen and put away her groceries, stuffing the empty bags into a space between the counter and the wall, and remembered she had muted her watch when she went into Starbucks. She checked her messages. One was from her mum, inducing the familiar twinge of mum guilt. The rest was spam that her filters didn't catch, one of them advertising the next generation of spam filters. She stopped for a second and debated whether or not she should call her mum back now. She decided she didn't want it hanging over her head when she was in the lab, and knew that the longer she waited, the greater the chance her mum would go snooping around. She'd know she was home. She'd know Nikki got the message. She kept meaning to disable her mum's ability to track her watch's position, but she knew that would mean a shitstorm of drama. If she needed to be untraceable, she could always take it off and leave it at home, as high school a maneuver as that was. She stood in her kitchen, paralyzed by indecision. She looked at the groceries, unappealing since she'd eaten almost a whole packet of sandwich fixins on the way home. She watched a fly loop around and land on her garbage lid. She checked it, 3/4 full. Wow, if it's attracting flies, I'd better get rid of it. She tied it up and lifted it out of the can, watching for a second to see if there were any drippings. As she left her house, she realized that the depot closed in 15 minutes, so she picked up her pace, walking the plank to the sidewalk and step-swinging the bag. The setting sun stretched her shadow out, making her look like a lurching zombie coming out to feed. She admired a grand old house done up in canary yellow. It was similar to her own, at least 100 years old. A walkway stretching out to the sidewalk to compensate for the fact it was built on a slope. Nikki loved the style. It made her feel like she was living aboard a pirate ship. Too bad the False Creek flood hadn't happened here, Nikki thought sacrilegiously. I'm sure these things are seaworthy. She got to the depot and went right up to the scale and plopped the bag down on the belt. It came to $8.343, so she held her watch up to the pay plate till it dinged and the belt started up. Thanks, the voice echoed in the empty depot as the stained belt moved the bag towards its black maw. She headed for the door, happy to leave the stinky and somehow creepy place. The recorded voice sounded hungrier than it had when there were even a few people lined up in there. She waited unconsciously for the "That was delicious" recording to play as she pushed the door open. Instead, she got, "P.U. Don't you wish you could have just said, 'empty garbage'?" followed Nikki out onto the street. The "Go for self" tagline was cut off by the closing door. She smelled her hands, fine, and glanced back at the green garbage can icon glowing in the half-light. As she headed home through the empty streets, she felt a little lonely. Since she had moved here, most of the kids her age who hadn't left Vancouver had moved to the apartments around Commercial Drive, but Nikki felt that moving to the drive, still busy with people, would be a kind of living in denial. Plus, there was no way she could afford as much space there. She heard squeaking when she got in, and remembered she hadn't fed the flukes. Nikki walked into her living room and looked in the fluke cage. 2 of them were sleeping, but the other one was doing his best to wake them up. "How are you, my little meal tickets?" Nikki said, in her best imitation of Simone's baby voice, reaching into the bag of critter kibble. She fed the one that was running around, panting with his big eyes glazed over, and the other 2 blinked awake. "Ah, yeah, now you're awake. Where were you when I was taking in the groceries?" The flukes looked at her and started to whine. She chucked the other 2 pellets in the cage and rolled up the food bag. Checking the time, she decided to get something done before JK arrived, so she headed up to the 3rd floor. She caught a glimpse of her new haircut in a mirror. Do I look like an idiot with this hair? She wondered. She had had a shoulder-length, ragged cut for ages, and she needed a change, but she half suspected she'd done it to dramatically mark the end of her relationship. Kathy would have hated it, she thought, giddily. On the top floor stairwell, she stepped up on the wooden chair, pushed open the hatch, and pulled down the well-oiled ladder that led up to her laboratory. The lights came on, gradually, as she stamped down the hatch. She looked up with some regret at the covered skylight and window, even though it would have been pitch black outside by now. She remembered being excited by the skylight when she'd first found the house, figuring it was perfect for a bedroom. But Kathy complained of having to climb down in the middle of the night to go to the washroom. It was a pain, but still, it would have been so cool to wake up to the sun. And so the lab ended up here instead. When Kathy ended up moving to Frisco, Nikki couldn't be bothered moving all the lab equipment out. What had started out as a small operation with an easy bake and a shaky table had expanded into quite a bit of stuff. Wedged against the slanted roof was a long silver counter with tons of beakers and vials and other antiques that Nikki had a soft spot for. The computer setup was also outdated but stable. Like the rest of the equipment, she'd scooped it up when the genetics department was phased out. She called up her active in silico experiments. 2 had been birthed alive. One was a 3-headed fluke she'd called Cerberus, and the other had a single eye in the middle of its forehead. She focused in on the Cyclops fluke first, noting with satisfaction that it was blinking normally. The last version had been birthed with a messed-up eyelid. She called up the Cerberus fluke. It wasn't doing as well, only one of the 3 heads breathing normally. She zoomed in on the organs and got the computer to diagnose. The heart glowed red, 125% the normal rate. The lungs were within normal parameters this time, although still a little off. Nikki sighed. Maybe 3 heads aren't better than 1. She went back to the Cyclops and introduced different stimuli. The model fluke barked happily when it was introduced to food pellets, sexual partners, and petting. It looked good to Nikki, so she decompiled the dog into its spawning ingredients. To free up some memory, she went back to the sick puppy and deleted it. The computer, as it always did when deleting, made a tinny scream. It was just a morbid thing the Easy Cut programmer put in, but it always reminded Nikki of the first time she heard it. It had been in the first week of classes, when they were all getting trained on the equipment. Her professor, a tiny outspoken Asian woman, was showing them how the in silico programs were used. Now, when I was a little girl, we were still dealing directly with the meat. None of this computer simulation crap. We'd use in vitro fertilization, being very, very careful. But things still went wrong, and when it did, you'd have to take the sick little creature and terminate it. She deleted the current experiment, and the computer screamed. She smiled as the small crowd of students jolted back. "Newbies," she mocked. As Cho pushed by them to the next piece of equipment, Nikki noticed her earlobes kicking. Nikki remembered being more surprised by Professor Cho's highly modified earlobes than she was at the scream. She'd never seen club kickers in real life. The early body modification that pulsed with sound had been unfashionable for more than 20 years. After she got over the shock, Nikki decided it was gutsy. And still later, she thought it hinted at why Cho stayed in genetics when it had ceased being scientifically relevant. She just didn't care what people thought. At the end of Nikki's second year, her department was shut down, and Nikki had made an appointment to see Cho, supposedly for direction on which stream to take now. Cho had been working on an in silico experiment of a tri-lunged horse when she came in. She'd waved Nikki into a chair and made a few more adjustments before closing the horse. When it blinked out, Cho leaned back in her chair and tilted her head. "I'm kind of surprised to see you here," Cho had said. Nikki just looked at the professor's small smile, trying not to stare at her dancing earlobes. "You struck me more as someone who knew what she wanted to do," Cho continued, "while the people who've been in this office lately are a mess. But this has been coming for a long time. There haven't been any jobs in genetics for a decade, except teaching jobs. We're lucky the school is allowing students to transfer some of their credits. When the arts were phased out, they didn't even get that." Nikki wondered at the prof's defensiveness. Was it because she'd been dealing with angry students all week, or was it the knee-jerk reaction of the professional know-it-all? She decided to cut to the chase. "What's going to happen to the lab equipment?" Cho looked like she hadn't considered it. "It's too outdated to be of use to any other department," she thought out loud. "They'll junk it, I suppose." Keeping her face neutral, Nikki said, "I've got a couple of experiments I'd like to finish, and I don't have access to anything like that." Cho nodded, her eyes suddenly hard. She touched the bridge of her nose. Yes, well, I'd be putting myself at risk if anything unorthodox was to happen to them." Nikki was suddenly very glad she hadn't ever talked to Cho about personal matters. "I looked at the prices for them used, and they're way too much. I'm gonna have to move out of my place as it is. My situation isn't very good either," Cho said with discomfort. "Your parents, They've cut me off," Nikki said, preferring not to elaborate. Something in Cho deflated. "Yeah, me too. There are no jobs in a digital world for us dirty meat workers," she murmured. "Information architecture, young lady, that's what I suggest." "Yeah," Nikki said, trying to keep her voice respectful. "That's what my mom said." A few weeks later, Nikki had a fully functional lab in her attic. A little slow, but it was a stable system with Genome 2035 installed. The Easy Bake Oven was handy to have. No more having to send out her experiments to be compiled. And if the beakers and test tubes she had scored cluttered up the place a little, they at least gave her a sense of history. Not just ancient history either. They reminded her of first year, working late to finish an experiment alongside other students. Someone would inevitably cook up something and wanted them to break the tension, and there was a lot of that. With the stress of deadlines, the limited equipment, and the egos, at some point for incentive, someone would come from the chemistry lab and set a steaming beaker of something yummy and narcotic within everyone's sight. Thinking of those long nights and fucked up mornings, Nikki felt a wave of nostalgia. To fight how suddenly alone she felt, she asked the computer for some fast and melodic music. She started a new Cerberus fluke and began to work on its organs, hiding everything except the problem lungs and heart. Maybe I could get a little more room by getting rid of the spleen. A few hours later, her watch spoke. "Hey, Nikki, I'm at the door." "Ah, hey, JK, down in a second." A ladder and 3 flights of stairs later, she could see his big frame silhouetted in the lace-curtained window beside the front door. "Sorry I'm late," JK said as he stepped in. He looked around her place in his characteristic way, stooping and peering intently through his small spectacles. "No biggles, I've been chipping away in my lab." "Man, you've got a haul. I wish I had a haul," JK said, looking for a place to hang his bike. Nikki took it from him and arched her eyebrow as she hung it on a coat rack, saying, "Were you in a big hurry or something?" JK grinned. "Nah, I just felt like riding." Nikki shook her head on their way upstairs. "You're a reckless fool, JK." He shrugged. "It's not dangerous anymore. Who's going to hit me now? Man, you've got a living room. I want a living room," JK said as they passed through it. Nikki couldn't resist showing off the spaciousness by spinning, her arms extended. "Gotta move to Strathcona, son." "Your hair looks great when you spin like that," JK said, laughing. They climbed up into the attic, and as JK squeezed his shoulders through the hole, Nikki cleared out some dishes from the Easy Bake. She got an empty one and handed it over to him. He set it down on the silver counter and pried it open. He took a small metal box from an inner pocket and removed some seeds from it, and while he was painstakingly placing them in the container's compartments, Nikki wondered why he didn't just get rid of the muscles when he was constantly dealing with tiny things. And if he was going to spend money on body mods, why didn't he correct his vision first? But watching him focus on the task, Nikki decided she didn't want to ask. It was more interesting in a way, not knowing. He clicked the box closed and passed it to her. She put it in the Easy Bake and set it to organics only. "You don't need the box copied too, do you?" JK shook his head. "Nope. I put them in there so they're separated enough. Last time I did them loose, they were a bunch that fused together." 100 of each enough?" JK licked his lips, looked pained. "Oh, that'd be great, but I don't know how much extra you have." Nikki cut him off with a raised hand. "It's okay. I got the machine pretty much fully loaded, and my projects are one of a kind rather than mass-produced, so I don't need that much." She set the machine to working. "The job will take about 8 minutes," the Easy Bake said, "and it will use under 1% of remaining toner." "See?" Nikki said. I'm going to get a cup of tea. Want one? JK's face lost its anxious look. Ah, he said, nodding and rummaging around in his bag. A few seconds later, he produced a jar full of dark leaves. I brought tea. Nicky, halfway down the ladder, looked at the jar and raised a quizzical eyebrow. JK just smiled and put the jar under his arm, followed her to the living room and through to the kitchen. Nicky was already reaching up for a Tetra box of Starbucks Earl Grey. Oh, come on, JK said, unscrewing the jar and taking out a leaf. I just need a pot of boiling water and then we'll have tea. Sorry, no pot, Nicky said with a smile, whacking the box against the counter and peeling it open. She set 2 mugs beside it, and when a spiral of steam slid out of the opening, she poured one for herself. She looked to him to see if he wanted one, and he nodded with defeat, twisting the lid back on the jar. Oh, come on, she handed him the balloon-festooned mug. Lordy, lordy, look who's 40, and slapped him on his shoulder. You remember what happened that last time I had one of your herbal potions? JK's face cracked into a mischievous smile. You said you wanted to get wasted, he said. If it hadn't been after a keg of beer and a gender bender, it would have been fine. Nicky let her silence be the response, although really she was pleased he got her out of trying whatever it was he had. She settled into the big quiltwork armchair and stretched her legs out. JK put the tea down on the coffee table and put a finger into the fluke cage. So you're still passing off these rat dogs as canine bonsai, JK said. Yep, Nicky said, taking a sip of tea and resting the mug on her belly. That's where I was headed when I saw you on the drive today, actually. Got enough to get me through next month. Sweet, JK said, finger wrestling with the little creature. And they never catch on and come back. Nicky shrugged. Your average person doesn't know the difference between a simple rat dog splice and a bonsai. Other than the lifespan and the jaw strength, there's not much to tell them apart. Plus, I always sell to tourists, so I know they'll be on a plane pretty soon and it'll get confiscated. Yeah, the drive's filthy with tourists these days. Lots of people doing a final tour before they upgrade. Easy pickings. Nicky took another sip and looked up at the ornamental ceiling, water-stained, but still grand. Yeah, I feel kind of bad about it, but there's no real harm done. If they have the money to fly or upgrade, then they can afford to support the local culture. Desperate times require desperate measures, murmured JK. Can I feed them a tea leaf? Don't, you freak. They have a very strict diet. Nicky looked away from the ceiling and straight at JK. The thing is, though, I don't feel like these are desperate times. I've been living off this scam for half a year now, but she lolled her head again. Just because I'm clever enough to find ways to live decently in this shitty world doesn't mean the world isn't shitty. JK turned away from the cage and ran a hand through his shaggy hair. Well, he started, a tea leaf sticking out from a corner of his mouth. He sucked on it thoughtfully. It's not that things are getting worse. In some ways, they're getting better, easier anyway, less hassles. It's just that the world is losing relevance. He pulled the leaf out from between his lips and dropped it into the mug. I don't want you tripping out on my living room floor, Nicky warned. This is a respectable place. It's seriously just tea, Nicky, JK said. From India? How do you get a hold of raw organic stuff? She challenged. Not from your mail order club. It's, not through the mail anymore, he said, vaguely. Your job is completed, said Nicky's watch. Would you like to? Nicky shut it up with a tap and set her tea down. I'll grab it. Just stay here. She made her way up to the attic, opened the Easy Bake, and carefully took out the sheaves of seeds. With minor spills, she was able to slide most of them into the original container, hoping that was what JK wanted, and seal the lid. Then she made her way down, telling the system to save and shut itself down, feeling her body complain as she climbed down from the lab. She was too tired to do any more work tonight. The tea had failed her. JK was back at the cage, looking at the flukes. Want one? Only 10 grand, Nicky cracked as she handed him the container. Oh, fantastic. he said, looking inside. Yeah, the machine doesn't divide by color, Nikki said. You'll have to do that by hand. You wouldn't believe how much stress this saves me, Nikki. You're an angel. Not an octopus? Nikki said, tugging on her pigtails. Same difference, JK laughed. Seriously, last time I had to go to Kinko's. They don't have easy bakes there, she said. JK nodded. I know, but they do organic duplication. But I was incredibly nervous the whole time, assuming they'd make me, fill out an intent of use form. What are you doing with them anyhow? Nikki said, hoping to stop the waves of gratefulness before they built into a tsunami. Another new growth party. Hopefully you'll be able to go to this one. Well, hopefully you'll tell me about this one, Nikki said, poking his big chest. Oh, I know. Sorry about that. Yeah, but now you're practically a patron, so I'll send you the coordinates. Excellent, Nikki said, stifling a yawn. JK grabbed his backpack from where he had laid it beside the couch and opened it up. He noticed something there and pulled it out. Oh yes. He took a little holocoin out and tossed it on the floor. A unicorn crawled out of it and pranced in a circle, stopped, seemed to notice Nikki and said in a whinny, "No, come to see Mike Knox's show." JK was putting away the container. I figured you were working with similar themes. Nikki gave a one-shoulder shrug. Sorta. The show invite was a floating, large-bosomed woman now who was intoning the time and place. I met him once, and he struck me. She looked at JK. Do you know Mike? JK made the finger gesture for a little. I don't know. Maybe I'll go, Nikki said, picking up the coin projector. He's a bit arrogant, JK said, putting on his backpack. Yes? They laughed at her vehemence. It might be the fact that we're working in similar territory, though, Nikki admitted. JK shook his head. It's so different, though, in terms of treatment. Nikki squinched up her mouth, nodded. I think so. JK noticed the time. Holy yikes! I gotta scram. He reached for the door. See ya. Nikki turned and walked into the living room, grabbed the jar of tea. Not without this, you're not. Shit, JK said, shouldering off and opening his backpack. Ooh, can't forget that. Okay. See you for real this time. JK opened the door and left. Later, Nikki said, and shut the door. It wasn't until she was coming back from the living room with the empty mugs that she noticed the bike, still hanging from the coat hook.